I put the original presentation together. I think they did another image in 2011, around about that sort of time, possibly early 2012, and they've improved the look. It looks more like a real lunar module now.
Right.
But here we see the lunar rover parking spot on the right here. This is their label. This is what they say. We've just got this black smudge with a few white dots next to it. That according to NASA, is the lunar rover vehicle. Which, if if we remind ourselves what it looked like, going back to this slide, we've got the lunar rover parking spot, and it's a black smudge.
Right.
What's that about? Right. Is that really become that? I mean, does this make any sense? It certainly doesn't make any sense to me.
Yeah. Why is there a black zone around what looks like this solid area in the middle? What's the black zone? Presumably it's shadow, but shadow wouldn't be cast like that. You wouldn't have thought all around it.
No.
It looks a bit strange.
It does.
So you would contend that all of those images are bogus then?
I would contend that they must be bogus. Yes.
Right. I've heard two different stories about the Chinese images, because they are alleged to have had lunar orbiter. Is that? I believe so. Yeah. Right. So I heard initially that they'd brought out images in, I think, February 2012, but I had an email from somebody saying, well, actually, why haven't they released them for public viewing? So I'm not sure whether the Chinese images are available, but they're alleged to be extremely high definition. So maybe we can check that after the show and just put a caption on as to the status of this.
Right,
because, people would say, well, if China have seen them, then they're obviously there, because China represent an independent adjudicator, if you like. This is one argument that I always use as to why I'm ambivalent about it. I don't get caught up in the argument of whether we landed or not, because there was no guy with his clipboard stood there on the surface of the moon watching the thing come down, going, yep, tick, landed, tick, like they do in the national lottery. They have a guy there with his white gloves on, an independent adjudicator. Where is the independent adjudicator in the Apollo landings? We've got NASA's word. Hey, China is the independent adjudicator. But hang on, is China independent? Which was a comment that Judy Wood made in the previous show.
Right.
Do we believe that at some level countries are actually acting independently, especially with pertaining to space? Or is there some overarching agenda? There's a lot of information that Andrew has on the moon landing, so we're actually going to film a second show. I think that that there are other things that they're possibly hiding as well, concerning what is on the moon and the UFO phenomenon as well, which we'll probably talk about that next week.
All right, secret space program on the
second week. Right, let's just address some of the arguments which people claim prove that they did land on the moon with the rocket-based Apollo missions. Now, there's a radio dish was placed in Australia because the Apollo, the position of the Apollo craft wasn't always in radio contact with NASA, so they had to use a radio station on the southern hemisphere, which relayed messages. So how could they fabricate that? Right,
yeah, I mean, there's this story is told in the film The Dish, which has got Sam Neill in it, and these two guys in the outback working this dish, which made sure they had to make sure it worked to pick up the signal from the landing. And but that doesn't prove they landed, because it's very easy to put a transmitter in a space capsule and send it to the moon. I mean, if unmanned probes had landed on the moon already, such as Lunokhod 1, the Soviet rover,
and you would agree that they landed on the moon?
I think they must have landed, unmanned probes on the moon. Right. I'm pretty sure that they went. But the manned missions, that would be a completely different kettle of fish.
And that's the other question you're talking about, communication with NASA. You've got this room full of operators looking at screens who are all monitoring different elements of the mission. They might be monitoring the astronaut's heart rate or the voltages within the cabin, and then you see them all get up and cheer and hug each other when they've allegedly landed. So what, are they all part of the conspiracy, Andrew?
Well, I mean, that's a good question. Another good question. Are all these people looking at all these screens part of it? Were they all told not to talk? to me, the most obvious thing seems to be that they, they did have to set up simulations for the equipment to run through all the procedures. For most of them, for the majority of them, they may be watching 1 or 2 systems, looking at the measurements coming back, the telemetry. Are they going to know whether they're watching a simulation or the real thing?
Okay, so you think the majority of them would have been duped as well, so they keep as few people into the...
Right, I think so.
Now what about Apollo 13, I think it was, where they had a problem and they started losing oxygen in the cabin as they were coming back? Is that right? Was it Apollo 13?
No, they never got there. They had to
turn back, and they had to manufacture something which would get rid of the carbon dioxide to keep them alive, basically. And all of these scientists at NASA started scratching their heads saying, well, what's in the cabin? What can we give them to make? And they made a device which would get rid of the carbon dioxide. So do you think that's all true?
Well, I don't think Apollo 13 landed on the moon. I don't even think it went round the moon. So that again was a whole thing was stage managed. I think partly because people were losing interest in the Apollo mission, and they needed to keep its profile high enough for long enough to do what they wanted to do, which we'll perhaps talk about in the next program. But one of the things that John Lear pointed out about the Apollo 13, which I believe is correct, and again, if any of you wants to verify this and find different, then great. If we can be corrected on anything that's wrong, or I can be corrected on anything wrong. But John Lear said that if you look at the proposed time for the landing of Apollo 13 on the moon, which it never actually landed, according to the official story, it would have landed in darkness. And I've simulated this in a solar system simulator called Redshift.
Yeah.
You can look at the timing of the landing, and indeed it appears that it would have landed on the dark limb, or very close to being in the dark. And you would not land.
They would never do that.
No, they would never be land in the dark.
It would create immense problems for them to land in complete pitch black.
Right.
All right. Now you mentioned John Lear, and he has analysed a lot of the early images put out of the moon, as has Bill Cooper. And they actually claim there are structures on the moon, which we'll look at next week into those claims. And also, just to touch on the astronauts, because we're going to take a closer look at what some of the astronauts have said in next week's show. You contend that they are all either persuaded or mind controlled in some way to perhaps either believe that they did walk on the moon when actually they didn't.
Well, I mean, again, if you look at their behaviour, or those that have been interviewed about this, I mean, like, a couple of them are dead and so on. Neil Armstrong died recently, obviously. But if you look at their behaviour, it indicates that they do believe their story. But the stories are not consistent. The stories don't add up.
Right.
That's the problem.
Okay, Andrew. Well, we're going to look more into the astronauts next week, but that's all for this week. And remember, believe none of what you hear and only half of what you see. I'm Richard D. Hall. Good night.